Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Kathy. We've got quite a bit to cover today, so I think we'll get started. I'll leave a business card on the table if anybody does want to follow up with any questions afterwards. A copy of the slides will be posted to the STEM Central website, so you don't need to bother taking down too many notes. According to Kenneth Fraser, CEO of Merck, the pharmaceutical industry is poised to translate the most promising scientific breakthroughs into meaningful treatments to tackle some of today's most urgent and vexing medical challenges. Now, you would have heard in previous STEM sessions about the complexities associated with product development. And in addition to the need for a focus on the customer, for knowledge management and for data integrity, product development scientists and sponsors have to be able to negotiate through a myriad of regulations and adherence to best practice. So in the time we've got available today, I wanted to discuss product development using just a few of the pathways that are available. And what we'll do is we'll see what they've got in common and what makes some of them unique. I'm just going to start off by going through some numbers. They might be a bit mind-boggling, but the references are all up there on the website, and I'm sure you've seen these sorts of numbers before. So this is just a quick introduction to the talk. On average, it takes about 12 years to take a new medicine from discovery right through to the marketplace, with clinical trials alone taking about 6 to 7 years. The average cost to research and develop each successful drug is estimated to be about $350 million US, with a recent report putting that at 2.6 billion when the cost of failures and the early screening and assessments are taken into account. Only 1 in 5,000, or 10% of the drugs that begin this journey ever make it into clinical trials, into human testing, and of those, only, I think according to this report, only about 10% get through to the marketplace. When they do succeed, though, it is cause for celebration. Some of you might have caught up with this in the news last week. Billy was flown into Perth from the US as part of the Science on the Swan seminar to help celebrate the work of Steve Wilton and Sue Fletcher. Their new drug for the treatment of a very rare muscular dystrophy, which they've licensed to a US company, was approved by the FDA last year. But we'll hear more about this a bit later on. Back to the figures and the bad news. A more recent study, quite a comprehensive one, does paint quite a gloomy picture, showing that the overall probability of success of a product starting out in clinical trials is less than 10%. And that of the 14 major disease areas, oncology has the lowest success rate at about just over 5%. This particular study involved 7,500 development programs from 1,100 companies over a 10-year period. So there's quite a lot of data. And again, a bit of the gloomy news is that phase 2 trials progressing to phase 3 has got the lowest approval rating, coming in at about 30% on average. But again, if we just focus on oncology products, we can see that that number drops to 25%. So what we're looking at here is the likelihood of getting from a phase 2 trial into a phase 3 trial being just under 25% for our oncology products. Now again, I appreciate that there's a lot of numbers on the slides. The report that this presentation's come from is on, will be on the internet as part of your resources. Now, I'm not going to go through the numbers in a great deal of detail. I'll just point out a couple of things to you. Most of these disease areas end up with between 80 and 90% approval. Sorry, that's once the application gets submitted, 80 to 90% of them get approved. Now, oncology products are on the high end of that, being up at the 90%. And what you can also notice here, the oncology products have got the lowest approval time, so ranging from just over 1 year to 2 years, according to this study. Now, it's also worth noting that when a selection biomarker was used, it increased the likelihood of approval for our phase 1, likelihood of approval of a phase 1 drug candidate getting through to the approval process, increased it from less than 1 in 10% when no selection biomarker was used to about 1 in 4 or 25% when the selection biomarker was used. So with the odds against you, how can a development scientist contribute to the success of a development project? Well, apart from making sure that you're doing the right experiments, you need to make sure that you're applying a scientific rigour to everything you do, based on knowledge, obviously of the science, but also of the regulatory pathways and guidance documents, and also ensure data integrity, even or especially when the results are unexpected or disappointing. And it is worth remembering, as hard as it might be, that you learn more from your failures than you do from your successes. And in this business, if you're going to fail, it's better to fail quickly and for the right reasons. Nobody wants to fail because of ignorance, poor science, or non-compliance. So with that bit of a lead in, I want to talk now about the regulatory framework for bringing a new drug to the marketplace. Now, for the purpose of today's session, we're a bit constrained by time. I'm just going to focus on the US and the Australia regulatory requirements. They'll generally represent what's happening in the major developed countries around the world. Now, the drug development process, as you know, is lengthy and detailed, but it is logical and it does have clear milestones. This is a fairly simplified, generic version. We'll look at the complexities in a little bit more detail later on. But just for now, notice that we've got our animal studies or our preclinical studies ahead of our phase 1, 2 and 3 clinical trials before we get to our submission and review of our new drug application. It is also worthwhile pointing out on this slide that we do have the post-market review, which is sometimes referred to as a phase 4 clinical trial. And I'll talk to you about that a bit later on too. Now, there's a lot of information in this slide, and again, you'll have access to it later on. Don't worry too much about the detail. What I want to point out, this is a history of the development, the introduction of the FDA and the development of the GMPs in America. What's worth noting is that over 100 years ago, the FDA and the GMPs came into being because of safety issues. And over the next 100 years, every time there was a problem with a product in the marketplace, the US government, the FDA, responded by more legislation. The US has what we call a rule-based system, where their GMPs are enshrined in their codes of federal regulations. Now, here we see the generic steps in the FDA drug approval process. Again, we'll talk about this in a bit more detail later on. A couple of things to point out. If you don't get the application right in terms of the formatting and the basic details, they will refuse to file it, and then you go back down to the bottom of the pile. If it is accepted, there is a scientific review, and the reviewers will say, well, the application is approvable. But what's important to note is the science needs to be supported by data from the manufacturing facility. So the application integrity and/or the GMP compliance through a pre-approval inspection. Now, this is important, and you need to remember this because I'm going to come back and ask you a question a bit later on. This slide shows that the US FDA approve around about 35 new drug applications annually. And within their new drug approval process, there's allowance for 4 different expedited review methods, which you can see from this slide account for about 73% of the approvals in the year just gone, 2016. Now, the drugs that were approved last year include one that I want to talk a bit more about in detail, Rubraca, which is used to treat women with advanced ovarian cancer. And we can also see here Steve and Sue's drug for DMD, which got approval last year. Both of those drugs went through the accelerated approval process. Now, people have traditionally thought of the US FDA as having the hardest drug approval process, and while it certainly is stringent, we can see here that they're achieving some good outcomes. In 2016, the FDA, through the CEDAR branch, approved 21 or 95% of the novel drugs at the first cycle of review. This means that there was no additional information that needed to be supplied, which could have slowed down that review process. And of the 22 drugs that were approved, 86% of them were approved in the USA before they were approved anywhere else. And one of the things that you might have heard in the news last week about the Steve and Sue's drug in Perth, the TGA have not yet started that approval process. So there was a bit of angst in the news you might have caught up with. Now, here you can see why the FDA might be so successful. This is just a snapshot of their org chart for their Office of New Drugs. And if you look just at the how many people they've got involved just in that Office of Haematology and Oncology. So a lot of specialists working to review these drugs. Now, I've included this slide just to show you how quickly the FDA are onto the science of drug development. This is just an example, and Amabel will show you some more, of the type of guidance that FDA publish. Now, note the date on this, June 2015. Now, it is still in draft. Sometimes these FDA guidance documents can stay in draft for the longest time. But note how quickly they get onto them. Now, this approval of this drug has not been without its controversy. So to end this topic on a slightly sour note, The FDA did receive some bad press over their approval of our Exendess 51 drug. The detractors include the second largest insurance company in the US, Anthem, who have refused to fund this drug, which costs $300,000 US a year, and the profile of the people who get DMD typically starts to show around about 5 years of age, and if they're on the drug, they're going to be on it for a long, long time. So Anthem are not yet funding it. The largest insurance company in America has said that they're going to fund it, but Anthem said that the data didn't demonstrate a cost benefit, didn't demonstrate efficacy, and also the FDA regulator overruled the advice of the scientific committee that said that the efficacy data was questionable. Now I want to turn our attention to the Australian regulatory system. We have in this country a national medicines policy, of which there are 4 main elements. This slide shows those 4 elements and the role of the TGA. What we're going to focus on today is the role of the TGA in ensuring that the medicines that we're able to receive in Australia are safe, effective, and of the requisite quality. The structure of the TGA essentially looks like this. I've highlighted the group responsible for scientific evaluation of new drugs and the group responsible for ensuring that they're manufactured correctly in accordance with all the rules and regulations. Again, make a note of that and where these 2 groups sit in the TGA, because I'm going to ask you a question about this shortly too. What I did have difficulty getting for today's talk was the makeup of the scientific evaluation committees. So I'm not sure what the numbers are like. I'm sure they're nothing like what we saw for the FDA. In Australia, it's the Therapeutic Goods Act that establishes the framework for the regulation of therapeutic goods. It has as its objective the safety, quality, efficacy, and timely availability of therapeutic goods. The thing to note from this slide, is our code of GMP, our manufacturing code of GMP, has not been codified into the legislations. We have in this country what we call a principles-based system, and that's the same in Europe and in Canada. The manufacturing principles are a piece of legislation, and that legislation points to the need for pharmaceutical manufacturers to comply with the Code of GMP, but our Code of GMP is not legislation. For these reasons, it makes it a little bit more difficult for the TGA to get prosecutions like the FDA can do. You can also note from this slide we have our product quality standards, and they are legislation. They include things like the various pharmacopoeias and therapeutic goods orders. Non-compliance with a product quality standard does put you outside the law. The Therapeutic Goods Act requires that pharmaceuticals for import into this country, for supply in this country or export from Australia are included in the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, the ARTG. Only goods on this register are approved for marketing in Australia. Now, what you can note from this slide, And here's where I want you to compare it back to that pathway we saw for FDA approval of products. We have our various types of medicines, our prescription, over-the-counter, and our complementary medicines being evaluated scientifically to end up on the ARTG. Separate to that, remember our two divisions within the TGA structure. We have the GMP compliance section, making sure that the manufacturers are manufacturing products to the right quality. It's a bit like being allowed to drive on the road. You need your driver's license and you need to have your car registered. Those two things happen completely separately, but you need both of them to be in place before you can legally drive. So something similar happens here. So just remember that comparison in America. It's all integrated and you get your product approval only when the manufacturing demonstrates the integrity of the scientific data that's been reviewed. In Australia, that happens a little bit quite differently in that it's separate. Back when I first started manufacturing, all those years ago, we would have the GMP inspectors come and audit our manufacturing facility. And they didn't have a clue what was submitted in those product registration dossiers. And that was fine from our point of view, because even though I was at CSL, where we had R&D and manufacturing all on the same site, people in manufacturing had no idea what the R&D team had submitted, the Reg Affairs team had submitted, because we weren't communicating, and we were essentially getting the formulation and the manufacturing process thrown over the wall to us. It doesn't happen like that anymore. The TGA, and through the availability of information, when the GMP inspectors come to the manufacturing site, they're armed with all the product registration knowledge, so they're checking that companies are manufacturing what was registered, even though our product registration process happens quite independently. Just a comparison, we saw the FDA approving about 35 new drugs a year. Here's the similar report from our TGA. Last year they approved 42 new chemical entities. In addition, they approved some orphan drugs and some products that had a new or extended usage. Now again, we haven't got time to do the detailed review, but you've got both of these, access to both of these reports, and you can look at them in more detail. Now the TGA are undergoing a number of reforms at the moment. For the prescription drugs and for the medical devices, those reforms are basically going to allow them to share working arrangements with comparable overseas regulators, and the FDA would be one of those. And they're going to also implement a priority review and provisional approvals, again, as we saw on that earlier slide about the FDA's expedited review processes. And the TGA are going to rely more on the assessments done by, again, comparable overseas regulators. So again, thinking about the Exondys 51 drug for the muscular dystrophy, again, be interesting to see what happens there. The last thing to note about the TGA, we have in this country a fairly unique system for approving products for clinical trials, which is one of the reasons why overseas sponsors like to do trials, early trials in this country. Our system allows for clinical trials to start before or without TGA approval. So through our clinical trial exemption, clinical trial notification scheme. And just quickly show you a little bit how that works. Again, this data is getting fairly dated. But the clinical trial notification scheme, TGA don't have to review it, they just have to be told that it's happening, so the trial has to be registered. Approval comes from the Human Research Ethics Committees, usually associated with the institutions. And you can see that approval is very quick, the fees are minimal, and 99% of all the clinical trials, at least last year, went through the CTN scheme. Clinical trial exemption. The exemption there means it's exempt from that being on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. And you can see it takes longer and is much more expensive. What I want to do now is just take you through a case study. And because we've been focusing on the oncology ones, I'm going to use a cancer drug. And if you can remember one of the drugs that went through the accelerated approval process of the FDA last year, this is the Rubraca drug for the advanced ovarian cancer. Here's a little bit about the company. Just have a quick look at their profile. Not too different from the profile of a lot of other companies. Rubraca was their first successful product through the approval process, but they've got others in the pipeline. They're working globally. And note that they're looking at for the companion diagnostics that direct their product candidates to the patients, and we saw there's a good reason for that because it does increase the likelihood of approval. A little bit about the Rubraca. Again, I know there's a lot of information on this slide. Maybe just a couple of things to note. The accelerated approval is based on a surrogate endpoint, that is a laboratory measure, or on some other clinical measure that the FDA considers is likely to predict the clinical benefit of the drug. It requires, though, ongoing confirmation studies. So yes, we'll give you the accelerated approval, but we'll see that there is a confirmatory study happening for our Rubraca product. So why would this product have been developed? The first thing we've got to do is work out the business case. So again, some data on the slide here pointing out a couple of things. 22,000 cases of ovarian cancer and 14 deaths per year in the US. It accounts for 6% of the cancers in women. If it's caught early, it's 90% curable, but because of the way it's mostly asymptomatic in those early stages, it's not identified until later on, where the chance of a cure is usually less than 20%. So a good case there. It's a type of drug called a PARP inhibitor. It's a new type of drug. There's many of these types of inhibitors in development, and they vary a bit in their route of administration, toxicity profile, efficacy, and resistance mechanisms. So one of the first things you need to do with your product development is come up with a good business case. Now, the FDA are advocating the use of a target product profile in the development of the drugs. Now, a TPP is a template or a format for the summary of a product development program, but it's described in terms of the labelling concepts. It is, in fact, the ideal version of what the product sponsor wants to claim in their labelling about the design, the analysis of the clinical trials. So it's all thought through quite early. The idea of the TPP is that it's shared with the FDA. So it becomes the basis for the regulatory strategy and the product approval. It is voluntary, and as I said, it's just with the US, the TGA are not talking about a TPP. And here's just an example of how you might use it. I'll just go back a slide for a moment. These are the main elements of the TPP. One of the sections in this document are indications and use. So here's just an example of the types of questions the TPP template asks you to consider. All right, so I'll just let you have a look quickly at some of those questions. We don't have time to go into them. Notice again the consideration for biomarkers and or a companion diagnostic. Again, one of the competitive advantages that the Clovis company has identified. This resource, or access to this resource, is also going to be up on the internet. The Mars group doesn't actually come from Mars, it comes from Canada. But this group's put together a couple of workbooks that are designed to help people work through the TPP templates. There's one for therapeutics, one for medical devices, and one for diagnostics. Once you've got your business case sorted out and you think you're onto a winner, we can start to look at the long process of getting your candidate product to market. Now, new product development for a pharmaceutical begins with discovery and doesn't end until the product is taken off the market. There's lots of scientists, technical experts involved, it's expensive, and it is subject to a complex set of regulations, codes of practice, and regulatory guidelines. You can see here we've got good research practices in the beginning, good laboratory practices for our animal or preclinical studies, good clinical practices for our clinical trials, and good manufacturing practices for the manufacturing and distribution. Before we go any further, I would like to discuss the role of the ICH. You'll see a number of references from the ICH. It's the International Committee for Harmonisation. It was launched in 1990 and fairly unique in that it brings together the regulators and the pharmaceutical industry, essentially from Europe, the US and Japan, but Australia and our TGA have also adopted the ICH guidance documents. If you jump onto their website, you will quickly be able to access all of the guidance documents under these four headings: quality, safety, efficacy, and a fourth category of multidisciplinary guidance documents. These are the ones that don't fit neatly into the QSE categories. Okay. This is another way of looking at that logical pathway of product development. Now, this model clearly shows the intent of product development, which is to ensure and to gather scientific data as evidence of the safety and efficacy of the product for the proposed indication. Now, this is where the ICH guidelines come into their own. There's a fairly general ICH guidance on risk management, which should be applied across that whole product development life cycle. We have ICH Q8, which deals with product development. In ICH Q8, you will see reference to the quality target product profile. And again, we've seen that the FDA have taken that concept from ICH Q8 and enhanced it by their own guidance document. There is a plethora, and Amabel will go through some of these, a plethora of ICH guidance documents relating to safety, a plethora relating to efficacy, and another plethora of quality-related guidance documents, all of which, again, come under this general banner of ICH Q10 for quality management. Now, these three guidance documents, Q9, Q8 and Q10, were all developed synergistically, and they were all meant to be used together. Before you can commence the study in humans, you must be able to demonstrate that it's safe in animals. This slide shows the key elements of a GLP study. Again, we don't have a lot of time to go through it. Importantly to note, the study must be conducted in accordance with a pre-approved protocol. We must qualify the animals that we're going to use. We must fully characterise the test article that we're going to be administering to the animals. The study gets conducted, quite a number of separate facilities involved. We can generate some raw data, some observational data about our test animals along the way. At some point we have to generate some specimens, urine, blood, histo specimens, records, compile the reports, and then make a decision as to whether the product is safe or not. The manufacturing process can change from the time we start this process of preclinical to our final successful product. So just note the importance of characterising the test articles. And before we move on, I thought I'd just give one example of what can happen if you're not following the GLP regulations. Should have pointed out before then, we've got two sets of guidance documents for GLP. Again, remembering we've got our FDA rule-based system where the GLPs are enshrined in the law. So here we've got our Code of Federal Regulations, Part 58. And then we've got what the rest of the world is doing, which is following the OECD principles of GLP. Okay, so regulations, principles. However, the intent is the same, but because they are regulations in America, if you're not following them, you can be in trouble. So here's just one example of an FDA warning letter to the study director of a GLP study, and I'll let you just have a read of the citation there. So the issue is not that things changed, the issue is that when things changed, nobody evaluated the impact of that change on the validity of the test results, and the study director had no control over it. This test facility could have been disqualified for this lack of compliance. All right, back to our pathway. Assuming that we've got the GLP studies finished in a compliant manner, noting that you can't retrospectively go back and make something GLP compliant. It all has to be done prospectively. Our first milestone is we've submitted our IND, our investigational new drug application, or our clinical trial application. Another guidance document. This is best practice for communications between the IND sponsor and the FDA. Again, one of the key messages is that there are a lot of guidances, and you do need a way to be able to navigate your way through them. So talk frequently, talk early to the FDA about what you're planning to do. The IND's got a lot of information in it. I've just highlighted three elements there to talk about. The pharmacology and the toxicity information, so everything that you've compiled from the GLP studies, the CMC or chemistry, manufacturing and control, which is where we now compare the chemistry, manufacturing and controls for our clinical trial product to the test article that we used for the GLP study and show that it's the same. and then the criteria for informed consent for the volunteers who will be taking our product. Another guidance document. This one is one of the multidisciplinary guidance documents from the ICH, the M3. So just some general considerations for the IND studies, proof of concept, safety, ADME. For our anti-cancer product, the Rubraca, we've also got some additional guidance. So in this case, we've got our ICH S9, so a safety study for non-clinical evaluations of our anti-cancer products. Again, for the advanced cancer, we don't have to have done all of those toxicity studies. Some of them we might need to have before we go for the marketing approval, but we don't need to have them all done before we go into the clinical trials because of the nature of the disease we're treating. More guidance documents. Now, again, these are fairly old, 1995 in this case. But if you're submitting products to the FDA for approval, you need to make sure that you're compliant with the ICH and the FDA guidance documents. But remember now that they are harmonised to some degree. Again, an example of the sorts of things that you might put into the CMC section for your phase 1. Resources that are available to help you, again from the FDA website, you can click through to all of these forms and instructions, and note that there's a checklist for the investigator just to make sure that everything's in order before they start that clinical trial. One thing to point out, this is the cover sheet for the IND, and this is signed by the principal investigator. And this is the legal contract between that investigator and the FDA. I don't need you to read it all, but just those highlighted points. I agree to do this, I agree not to do this, I agree, I agree, I agree, I sign it. Non-compliance now puts you outside the law, and you might end up in a sticky situation with the FDA. Okay, we conclude you did not adhere to the applicable statutory requirements and regulatory requirements governing the study. Specifically, and I'll just go through these quickly, that's putting it back into that legal context so you can see the clauses that are being referred to. In this case, failed to obtain informed consent from a number of the subjects on the trial. And in Part B, 10 subjects had the drug administered them before they signed the informed consent. In this case, again, I don't have time to let you read it, but this one relates to the fact that the Ethics Committee, the Institutional Review Board, had approved the study, but that approval had elapsed. So there's an expiry date on the clinical trial. That had passed, the review board hadn't re-signed, and in the time it took for them to re-sign the agreement, 6 subjects had been enrolled, and again, that's illegal, contract broken, and the principal investigator is now in strife. There's a number of reporting requirements, again, that are enshrined in that legislation, and what you can see here is the requirements for a time frame for reporting. So something serious, fatal or life-threatening, you must report within the 7 days. Other serious ones must be reported within 15 days. And if everything goes well, you must report at least annually within 60 days of the anniversary of the IND. Assuming the clinical trials go well, we can submit the new drug approval application. There's a few different pathways. We don't have time to go into those. Our Rubraca drug went through the 505 pathway, where we need full data obtained from studies conducted by or for the sponsor. And again, a lot of information here, but it is up on the website. The legal provisions for those expedited review processes come from a piece of legislation which is 506 of the Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act. So our rubraca drug went through the accelerated pathway, which is allowed for in those pieces of legislation. This drug also was able to be fast-tracked. It was considered a breakthrough technology. It was also got orphan drug status, and so it was able to be fast-tracked ahead of the allowable times in that Prescription Drug User Fee Act of 1992. And because of that orphan status, our rubraca product actually got a few waivers of fees and things like that. Information here as to when you should, if you want to go through one of these expedited pathways, when to submit that request. And again, we've already seen that the FDA want you to keep talking to them. So just discuss with the FDA quite early in the piece. More guidance documents. I did say that one of our milestones was to submit the NDA, but there's probably a milestone before that, which is to get through the pre-NDA meeting with the FDA. The idea of having the pre-NDA meeting is to uncover any potential problems, gives the sponsor a chance to familiarise the reviewers with the science behind what they're doing. And again, just make sure that at least the application's not going to be rejected because it doesn't meet the format, and whether the CMC data is sufficient. Again, without spending any time, one of the things that usually trips product development scientists up is again the setting of specifications. You don't want to set them too tight because then it might be impossible for anybody to make your product hereafter. You obviously don't want to set them too loose. Here's an ICH guidance document. This one's also branded by the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, so again a harmonised standard. So guidance on test procedures and acceptance criteria for new drug substances and drug products. Again, a good document to tell you how to set product specifications, which again will become legal requirements, product quality standards, when you've only got limited data. Also, it does it for product release, but also for stability. So again, it's very important to demonstrate that your products are going to be stable throughout that clinical trial period, and that the expiry that you put on your product to be marketed is able to be supported. Just one last thing, which I know Amabel's going to talk about in a bit more detail. This is from the ICH M4, one of the guidance documents. This is the common technical document. Now, we spent a bit of time talking about the FDA IND and the new drug application. The FDA have, since 2003, been accepting product INDs, NDAs in the common technical document format. So just quickly, Module 1 is not part of the common technical document. This is all those things that are country specific. In Module 2, we've just got our summaries of quality, safety through our non-clinical studies, efficacy through our clinical studies, and then we have more detailed modules which have got all the science to support those summaries. The NDA needs to provide answers to the questions that are up here on the board: safe, effective, benefits outweigh the costs, is the labelling appropriate and complete, and are the manufacturing methods guaranteed to ensure the quality, safety and efficacy. Now, just to finish this off, the rubraca that we've been having a look at, again, approved last year, is on the marketplace, but not the end of the line for Clovis Oncology. There is, as I said, a confirmatory study happening, and again, they now have to go into their good manufacturing practices and pharmacovigilance. So I'm going to leave it there and hand over to Amabel, who's going to help you, or give you a tool that's actually going to make it easier to navigate some of those guidance documents and resources I've been throwing out at you.
Sure. Thanks for that intro, Kathy, and thanks for that awesome introduction, Louise. You've kind of set everything up for me, and I'm just going to talk about what you talked about. Yeah. So if I haven't met you before, my name's Amabel Tan. Can everyone hear me? And I am a life sciences solutions consultant at Clarivate Analytics. And just to introduce our company a bit, we used to be part of Thomson Reuters. So the last time I spoke to you, we probably were part of Thomson Reuters, and they sold the intellectual property and science business. So now we operate as a scientific, as a separate company. But a bit of background about myself is I did my PhD at Melbourne University. Quite a while ago at micro and immunology, and then I worked in a biotech company where we were looking to run a clinical trial for a nanoparticle vaccine that was based on it was a spin-out company from a technology intellectual property generated at Monash University, and like many small biotech companies, the product it was decided not to continue with that product, and then they started developing something else, and after that I joined Clarivate Analytics or Thomson Reuters. So I've had a bit of experience with research as well as commercializing research, as well as performing like competitive intelligence around new drug programs, specifically around cancer drugs, and that was because the company that funded the biotech that I worked for was also an investment company, so they would put money into early stage cancer drug programs. That was their focus. So today I'm going to introduce you to a tool that can help you navigate the huge regulatory landscape that Louise has already introduced you to. So for this workshop, we wanted to keep it quite interactive. So I'm going to first just discuss some of the challenges that are faced by regulatory professionals. I'll discuss the product that I'm going to introduce to you and that you all will have trial access to for the next 2 weeks. And we'll look at how you can get in there and register, because sometimes that's the biggest barrier to the program is logging in and getting there. So we'll talk a bit through there. And then we'll look at how you can utilise this tool to understand the submission routes across different countries and the best practices. We'll look at how you can maintain multi-regional compliance. So Louise talked specifically around the FDA and the TGA format, but often people will be looking at running trials or marketing their drug in many different countries. So there are ways you would try and strategise to ensure you're compliant across those different countries. And then I've got some use cases. A lot of them actually relate to what Louise has already spoken about, and how you might address some of those questions or obtain the information you need to understand how you're going to tackle that question or that process. Just wondering, so for regulatory professionals, there's a huge challenge faced to them constantly, and it's in maintaining compliance when there's a rapidly changing regulatory landscape. And there's also a lack of convergence across different countries, not only over language, but also in terms of the way they interpret different guidelines. So for example, if you were, say, tracing, I want to follow the FDA guidelines, I want to file in the US, but I might also be looking at Australia, or say Japan, where English is not a first language, then I have to follow those agency documents. But I can't only just follow them, I have to follow legislation, I might have to follow some of the ICH guidelines, WHO guidelines. There's a huge amount of information you might need to track, and you'd have to go to all the different websites and follow them and set up alerts. But on top of the different agencies you might need to track, you've also got documents that are coming out. You've got documents that are old, that are still valid, and then you've got new ones that are replacing some of those documents that you followed. So there's a lot of information to keep up with. Just to give you some numbers behind that, over 2,000 regulatory documents were updated in our system in the last 2 months. So there's a lot of documents that regulatory professionals need to keep up with. In 2016, there were 169 FDA warning letters. These specifically related to GMP deviations, so we didn't actually trace any informed consent, so maybe people are watching out for that. We saw the majority were GMP deviations, so around the good manufacturing and quality that Louise mentioned. And how do you maintain compliance when you have 63 guidelines coming out just in the last 4 weeks? So there's things coming at you all the time. So the regulatory landscape is, it's constantly evolving, and maintaining compliance is like a moving target. So this is just an analysis around some of the warning letters that have been issued from the FDA over time. Last year it was 249 warning letters and untitled letters, and there's actually been a change. So early, if you look in the, does this point? Oh yeah. So some of the earlier warning letters were more around advertising, so problems with mislabeling and misadvertising your drugs. As new guidelines or laws have come out to prevent that, what we see more now is around GMP, so if you fail to maintain the quality expectations. For some reason, the first set of trials were just thrown out. They didn't keep that data. So they go through there and they audit and they check what you've been doing with your data, and they can pick up if you've been doing what could be perceived to be dodgy. So it's important that your data records are really solid and robust, and they will find out if you've been messing with them. So Clarivate and Analytics has a online intelligence platform, and it's designed to cover the full product life cycle. So around the development, the protection and the commercialization of new drugs or therapeutics or biologics. And what I think is quite interesting about this regulatory area, especially if you work with smaller companies or you might work with business development professionals, is the regulatory aspect comes in quite early. So it's not just for people who work in regulatory that they have to worry about what is the pathway, what are the guidelines I need to follow. A lot of regulatory considerations actually speak to how you might select a drug that you bring into your portfolio, how you would position your drug. So things like reimbursement, whether an insurance company will pay for your drug, can often dictate whether a drug will be selected for the portfolio. The pathway of regulatory approval can help determine the drugs they might select if they want to go down a particular pathway, take advantage of priority review. And it's also important to consider these aspects early in the development of a drug. So even from the beginning when you're developing it at the preclinical stage. And that more and more you're hearing even big pharma say that you need to consider the full development pipeline, the clinical trials and regulatory considerations, even at the stage of preclinical development. And one of the areas, for example, with clinical trials or preclinical stages where you might start to consider it is around biomarkers. There's been an increase in the use of biomarkers, and this is really reflecting the increased success that's seen with drugs that have included biomarkers, and that often speaks to the increased efficacy that can be seen when you've selected specific patients, but also identified a drug that would, or surrogate markers for a drug that is likely to work even before you go into clinical trials. I'm just going to go to the next slide. So if we look at the biomarker use, even in Australia, it's increased up to 69% since 69% of trials use biomarkers. A lot more are using what are called therapeutic biomarkers, so therapeutic efficacy, so a marker that indicates your drug works. There's been a 10 times increase in the use of genomic biomarkers, so to identify, for example, patients that are likely to that they may either represent a subpopulation of that disease population, or maybe a population that are likely to respond to the treatment. And why I think that's really important in the university setting is diagnostics and like biomarker intellectual property is the #1 type of intellectual property held by Australian institutes and universities. And so there's a wealth of knowledge and experience within the university that can lead or feed directly into, for example, biomarker detection as well as companion diagnostics. So it's even if you're not in drug development, the university has a lot of translational activities that does speak and pairs well with drug development activities. So going back to the regulatory aspect, I am going to focus on how you would use this tool to get regulatory information, but I think it's useful to keep in mind that this regulatory information could be considered early on in your product development or your research programs to consider how you should implement that early on. Okay, so just so you're assured that this information is valid and reliable, this database, the regulatory database, is used by 43 of the 50 large pharma companies in the world, and it's also used by CROs, so contract research organisations that provide regulatory consultation, as well as some of the health authorities around the world. So, getting to the system, everyone should have received a little tag which will give you some directions on how you should log in. I'm going to try and walk you through it. So, I'll just try and take you to the website so we can walk through that. Now, I do recommend you use Mozilla or Chrome because the platform is not supported with Internet Explorer. I'm just going to put that in. So if you follow the URL, you're going to have to type that in, or when I send you the PowerPoint deck, the hyperlinks will take you to the website that starts. But if you go to the website and then you click Product Login, so you will need to go through the registration process, but it's easy. You just type in the username that I provided, that's the first one, and then the second password, and everyone has the same password. And then you'll just be prompted with some questions. I try and pick ones that are really easy to remember, and then you should be able to access the program. So I will walk you through it. So I've got an example here. I'm just going to type in 2017 STEAM 35. And if anyone does ever have problems, then you're welcome to send me an email and I will help you out there. So if you type in the details, click Login. So if you have your laptop, it'd be great if you follow along, because then you can follow me when we go into the system and run it. So I'm just going to pick two that are really easy to remember. It's up to you what you want this to be. Australia, and then submit it, and then you'll be able to still use the same details to log in. Okay. Okay, so that should take you into the system. And you'll have access to this database for the next 2 weeks. So I recommend you do have a look in it. It is used by many pharmaceutical companies, SMEs as well. If you are at Melbourne University, the university does subscribe to this, but if you're not, you'll only have the trial access, so make the most of it while you can, and then you'll come to the system. So I'll let you continue logging in, and then I will introduce you to what is found in the system and how you would use that. Okay. So essentially the database was designed so that regardless of which countries you're looking at, if you look at one country or you look at maybe global regulatory information, that you would be able to come to one place and get all of that content there. So we host 4 different types of documents. I know it's a bit sort of boring to talk about it, but it will just help you find the information you will need later. So the backbone of the system obviously is what we call reference documents. These are the authority documents or the agency documents, such as those that are released by the EMA or the TGA. So just to give you an idea about an example of some of the agencies that we follow. So we have agreements with each of these agencies, and we either provide their actual documents or we provide a hyperlink. For example, with the TGA, we just provide a hyperlink. So we provide this for 80 different countries. There's 160,000 documents in there, so some of the older ones, like historical documents, as well as the new ones. But each one of these will be stamped with a valid or outdated stamp, so you know what to follow. So I think that also reiterates the huge amount of information out there. We do have drugs and biologics, and we're developing a medical devices area. So if you are interested in the medical device framework in Australia, or IVDs, or even say combination products, so a device that delivers a drug, we have some information in there that you might want to look at. So where I think we should focus our attention on, especially if you're newer to the regulatory area, is what we call regulatory summaries. So these are written in English, and they help you understand what is the local submission route, whether it's around how do I conduct a clinical trial, or what does the drug registration process look like in that particular country. And they're provided across these main topics, and I just highlighted on here some of the key ones that would be worth consulting. So there's the format and content, there's marketing authorization, and that also includes, for example, is there a priority review or an accelerated pathway available in a country such as Australia, and also clinical research and pharmacovigilance. So if you have no idea what the regulations are in that country around a particular topic, then this is a really good way to start. And these also include the medical devices. So you can come here, you can see what class of drug or what class of device am I working with, and what is the risk levels associated with that, and what do I need to follow if I want to register this product in Australia. And I've just highlighted some of the questions you can ask here, and we'll come back to this later with a use case. And the next type of document I wanted to highlight is called a regulatory intelligence report. It doesn't really matter actually what it's called, but it contains quite a few different documents. For example, the committee meetings and experts. So when a drug is submitted, a group of experts will come together and discuss the validity of the information around that drug and whether or not it should be approved. So you can come here and you can read about what's been discussed at that committee meeting, and it can give you a good idea about what that committee thinks about particular kinds of drugs, how they vote, and how that might impact your own drug application. And this is also where you can find things like product approval. So if you want to know, okay, what drugs were approved in the US? Were they new drug entities? Were they biologics, for example? You can go in there and have a look. And also linked to, if you wanted to see the full product approval package. So we saw one, just a sort of table of contents for Rubraca. You can actually come here and look at what does that product approval package look like? What would I need to put into the application that I would submit, say, to the FDA, and what is the amount of content I would need to include? And I wanted to highlight the product approval bulletins that we'll actually look in. So if you don't want to read a whole approval package, you can read these overviews, which will detail to you what is that drug used for? What are the patients that are targeted? What regulatory route or application did they use? And also give you some background around the competition or the market competition, so you can really understand what is the context of that drug use for those patients and in today's medical landscape with current available treatments. So I've just got some sample questions here around drugs that the FDA approved, which were biologics, and also looking at some of the recent approvals and their market competition. So how you get to them is through the browse button. So they're a little bit hidden, which is why we have to go through this sort of step-by-step process. But if you go to browse, you can see the regulatory intelligence reports or the summaries. And today we can focus on the drugs and biologics, but if you have an interest in medical devices, then have a look here at the medical devices. Okay, so the topics are arranged sort of in the order of the marketing authorization process, so you can understand. If you have an interest, say, in, we'll come here to the CTD, the format and content of applications, you can look at the marketing authorization procedure and say, you know, do I want to just know the general background? Do I want to seek priority review? Maybe you want to change something in the way that you manufacture that drug. You can look at information around there. So it really depends on your area of interest. If you want to know information about the product, so what would I need to describe in that product to the physicians and the patients, you can view that, as well as clinical trials, pharmacovigilance, and I thought I'd highlight pricing and reimbursement because that is a regulatory aspect, but it's also something people consider quite early on because it's around the strategy of how commercially viable might that drug be to us as a company, and how likely is it that this drug might be widely available in terms of whether or not it would be subsidised. And if a drug is subsidised, it's much more likely to be used. So even if your drug was approved, if it's not subsidised, if it's too expensive, then you're not going to get a huge traction for that drug, especially if it's extremely expensive, and it could be out of affordability for many, many patients. And then I'd also like to look at, so one of the mock questions I had was around which drugs were approved in 2016 and 2017, and yeah, you could Google it. Like there's nothing to stop anyone Googling anything. It's just that this would give you a more formalised way of looking at which drugs were approved through which pathway. You can look at the drug submission list, and we'll also look at the product approval bulletins. So I've just pulled up an example here of the product approval bulletins. This is just for this year so far, and I just wanted to highlight this particular one. It caught my eye because I know this is on the drug list of drugs to watch, and that's because it's been forecast to have it's over $3,000 million US sales in 2022. So it's predicted to be well above blockbuster drug. And this has been, sorry, I chopped some of that off, but it's the first biologic that's been approved for MS. And the product approval bulletin will give us some information around who was making that drug or who filed for approval, how it's used. So it's indicated for the treatment of adult patients with relapsing or primary progressive forms of multiple sclerosis. And it's the first approved biologic. It's a CD20-directed cytolytic antibody, so it gives us some information around how that works. And these are the different granting, like a priority review, sort of priority access routes that were given. So it was given a breakthrough therapy designation, fast track designation, as well as priority review. And if you wanted to read more about it, you can link it to there. And it will also summarise for you what were the clinical trials or what was shown, what efficacy was shown around that drug that was used as data to obtain approval for this drug. So you can better understand for a drug of this category, for patients that this is prescribed through, how is it expected to behave? And then if you come down later, we can look at the market competition. So that's just an example of how you can get a better idea about the format of the drug application and what would be expected to be provided. Okay, so that takes me to the first use case, and it was, does the US have a common technical document? What are the modules that would be included? So Louise has already given us a snapshot of the expected modules and the content. What are the other countries that might use this? So this is a question that we get a lot because if you are going to the trouble of filing for approval in a particular country, or even running a clinical trial, or preparing the packaging that you want to put on your clinical material or your final product, most people don't want to reinvent the wheel or redesign or reconstruct all of this information every time they look at a new country. So often the strategy will be finding a way that you can align all these activities across many different countries. And we can also look at, is it suitable for an NDA or a BLA? So let's have a look in the system together. And really, this is how you would find the information around any topic you want to find, but I'm just walking you through this so it's easier for you when you go in there. So, has everyone managed to log into the system? Great. So you just come to browse, we'll have a look. Let's start at the regulatory summaries. Clinical trials are not that simple in that you run phase 1, 2, 3 and then you can submit that information to every authority. It's not that simple. So some authorities will accept clinical trial information from, so Australia will accept often from other countries, but if you look at Asia, they're often looking for trials or bridging studies or multi-regional studies where you've considered the ethnic group that is dominant in that particular country. So there's some special requirements for clinical trials depending on where you run them. And there's also quality assurance. So if you wanted to know what are the GLP requirements in Australia, or I've got a filter, sorry, on for, I'm just going to see if I can turn, I'm just going to turn all the countries on so you're able to see what's available to you. Chances are you're probably going to focus on the US or maybe the Asian regions, but just so you can see that. So you could look at all of what are the quality assurance requirements for GCP, GMP, maybe GLP would be of more interest if you're running preclinical studies. And then you can also look at pharmacovigilance. So what are the kind of reporting I would need to do for clinical trials that I'm running in my country? Also, if you have trials run across different places. But we can start with the common technical document, and we'll just look at the one for the US. So the front page will just explain to you what the document is. So the ICH recommended the adoption of a common technical document, and it describes a common format for the organisation of information and for marketing applications in the EU, Japan and the US. So it covers those three countries. And then if you come into the document, we can see if there have been any updates. So in March, there was an update around the specifications of the document itself. You can link to that update there. And it looks like there was another attachment added in February. So what we can do is have a look at, just use the table of contents. What is the application content and structure? So we've already seen a snapshot of that. There's module 1 that's not part of the CTD, as Louise described, but we can look at what is required for the main bulk of the CTD. So there's the overall summary, there's non-clinical information, clinical information, and then if we want to see in more detail, we can have a look at, say, quality. We can look at module 3 and see what is the information that's required to be added, and we've got that info there. So I'm going to go to the next question, but that's just an example of how you can get the background information around what is required in that particular country. If I go back to the slides, okay, so the next use case would be what drugs were approved in 2016 or 2017 for DMD. So that was the disease that Louise has mentioned before, where you had a different name for it. I think you called it the API and I call it Exodus 51. I don't think I'm saying it right. But drugs will often have more than one name, their trade name, which may differ across different countries, and the original name. It might be the active pharmaceutical ingredient or the original antibody name that was given. But we can look at we can use the product approval bulletins to look at what the submission route was, and we can also look at some of the differences between maybe any of the drugs that were approved for the same indication in that year. So if we go to the system, so where you find information about product approvals is in the regulatory intelligence area. So you can also see things around, say, compliance and inspections if you're interested in warning letters and you know, the kind of deviations or citations that have been described, committee meetings. But let's look at the product approval information. So you can look at drug submissions across a number of countries. So if you wanted to see the full product approval package, what did they submit to the FDA in order to get approval, then you can come here and that would be found here. But I wanted to look at the product approval bulletins because these are more of like a synopsis of the product approval package. So this will give us a list. So you'll find a lot of information around regulations are lists of regulations or lists of regulations and where they are being used, just because there's so much information out there. But looking at the product approval bulletin, we've got a list of the products based on their product name, the active ingredient, the application and the company and some of the uses of those drugs. So our question was, what were the DMD drugs approved in 2017 and 2016? So looking at 2017, what we can do is just scroll down here and we could see which ones have been approved in 2017. I'm just going to scroll down slowly. So we've got quite a few drugs already that have been approved in 2017, and you'll notice quite a few were BLAs. So what BLA stands for is a biologic application, which is like an antibody-based drug or a protein or maybe a blood product, versus an NDA, which would be a small molecule drug. And we're seeing more and more BLAs being approved. Let's have a look down here. So the drug that Louise mentioned was Exondys, but what we have here is Emflaza, which is it's a non-biologic drug, it's an NDA that was from Marathon Pharmaceuticals, and this is also for DMD, but it's for patients aged greater than 5 years old. So we can have a look at that particular product. So it's very important not only that you get the regulations right, but in terms of the commercial strategy, drugs should be unique, because there's no point having a drug that does exactly the same thing for exactly the same patients, because it may get approved, but it's very unlikely the government or insurance companies are going to want to subsidise a drug that only replaces another drug. And also patients that have found treatments that work are not going to want to leave their drug for a new one. So you've got to think a lot about what's the use or the specific unique characters of those drugs that would make them worth approving, especially when you consider the huge amount of money you might throw at developing this drug. And it goes beyond even approvals, it's much earlier. If you are going to go into clinical trials with a drug that doesn't do anything unique, then why would anyone enter your clinical trials? Why would doctors even let you or recommend that you go for a trial, go off a current treatment that you're on that works, and then try a drug that might not do anything differently? So those are some of the aspects why we'd look at how do these particular drugs differ, and why were they both approved in such in a short span of time. It's got a bit of a funny look here. So I was prepared that the internet my view might look funny, so I'm going to just open up the bulletin I saved some of these files, and I can email these out if anyone's missing them. But this is the product approval bulletin for Emflaza, and we can have a look at. So for this particular drug, so this was approved in February of this year. It's a new drug application, so it's under the NDA, and it's approved for the treatment of patients with DMD that are greater than 5 years. So we can view here an overview of that particular drug. So it's a corticosteroid prodrug. It has orphan drug designation, but the precise mechanism of the drug is actually unknown. It also has fast track, but it has a rare pediatric disease priority review voucher. So correct me if I'm wrong, Louise, when you receive these vouchers, so I thought this was quite interesting, a lot of these regulatory vouchers that can give you reduced rates, or it's kind of like a trade-off if you're willing to work in a smaller disease area or something that could be quite challenging where there isn't a huge market potential. They can give you these incentives so they can reduce some of the costs or accelerate the review process, but you can actually sell these, is that right? Yes. So you don't have to use it for the indication. You could say, I'm developing this very rare disease drug, but then you can sell that to someone else. And I think that's recently happened, maybe with Sarepta. But it,
yeah, I know the scheme. I'm not sure of the details.
Yeah, but it's something that pharmaceutical companies or companies might do I don't exactly know why you do it, but it can be a revenue source to work in a small area where you think the drug will be very successful and you sell off that voucher later on. Anyway, that was just a side topic. But so we can see here what happened in the clinical trials, what was expected to come out of them, and how they achieved approval based on these results. What I quite like is if you can come down, and these are all the milestones that were reached, so I won't go into them, but you can see all of the different activities that had to be completed in order to get this approval. But I like to come down to the bottom because, actually, I won't miss this. So in the approval letter, there were some conditions on what they would be required to do for this drug. So we've got an oral carcinogenicity test characterising some of the metabolites, so pharmacokinetic information. But as Louise said, even after approval, there are some obligations that you would need to fulfil to ensure the safety of the drug. But if we come down to the end, we have the market competition. So we can see of this drug, what are the competitors out there? So some of these may be approved, but some of them may be in the pipeline as well. So they could be promising drugs that are coming out. So we have a mention of Exondys here that was approved in 2016. So that was from Sarepta, and that gained FDA marketing approval as the first drug in the US to treat patients with DMD. So that's one of their key competitors that's already out there. And there's also another drug that was reviewed. So it's, I know it is Dispersin, I always struggle with the names, or Condresa. And that's from BioMarin. That was specifically for patients that are amenable to treatment with an exon 51 skipping mutation. But they did not get approved, and I believe they went through another review process and were not approved either. But that can give you an idea of the context of that drug in the current medical landscape, and you can also see what's in the pipeline as well, so what might be coming out. So Pfizer has an experimental antibody, and also Daiichi Sankyo have another drug, but that's in quite early stages, so phase 1 to 2. So that's the product approval bulletin for Emflaza, and if we go back, and I don't know if it will work again, we can scroll down, have a look in 2016, and we could also view the product approval bulletin for Exondys. So this is quite an easy way to go through and have a look at what the approvals were like, but not have to go wade through the 300-page product approval package. So we go to 2016, we've got Exondys here. So those are for patients that are amenable to the exon 51 skipping. So you could read the product approval bulletin there, and it'll give you an overview of that area. So I'm going to go back to the slides now, and how do we get to the next one? Okay, I was just going to show this. This is just if you have an interest in medical devices or in vitro diagnostics, also drugs that might be combined with a medical device, then have a look in the regulatory summaries for medical devices and IVD, and they will give you a comprehensive overview of what's required to register a medical device or IVD in Australia. Okay, the last thing I wanted to show you was what we call global regulatory comparison. So I mentioned before that if you're looking to file a drug registration in many different countries, or you might be looking to run a clinical trial, then you would often want to look at what are the requirements across these many different countries so that you ensure that you're compliant with all of their requirements, but also to find the best strategy. And this is a document I get questions a lot about from our customers. So these are usually people who work in the specifically around the regulatory area, especially in pharmacovigilance, because it's extremely important that you report any of the adverse effects or even unexpected effects. And the requirements often differ across the country, across different countries, even if they're in the same continent. So it's really important for them to have a proper risk management or pharmacovigilance reporting program in place to make sure that they report adequately into the right place. So in addition to pharmacovigilance, you can also use these tables to compare things like the clinical research requirements, the clinical trial and marketing authorization timelines. So Louise talked about how the CTN and CTX pathways take different amounts of time to be approved, and that time is extremely important, because the longer you spend running clinical trials, or the longer time you spend waiting for ethics approval or waiting to get your clinical trial approval, the more time you're sitting on a drug results, possibly getting your drug approved, where a competitor might be speeding along, moving faster than you and getting their drug on the market faster. And once you've got on the market faster, once you've got all the patients in clinical trials, the slow takers are going to be challenged to find patients for their trials, find patients that will use their drug. So again, you come to browse, you select the global regulatory comparisons, and then you can choose the topic that you want to compare. They've got them there, that's quite self-explanatory. And you can just look across the countries that you're specifically focused on, and then align your strategy or your program according to that. And if you need to have more detail, you can quickly look at the regulatory summary. So those were the how-to guides we looked at before around, okay, what is the pharmacovigilance framework for that particular country, and what am I expected to abide by? So this is a use case, and this is a real question I've had from one of our clients. So I'm looking to commence trials that will be run concurrently across 4 different countries, including Australia. If an adverse reaction occurs, what are the pharmacovigilance reporting requirements in Australia, and what I need to report to other countries where the trials are being conducted? And there's also an aspect around a qualified person. So can anyone, maybe one of our RAs, just report these adverse effects, or does someone qualified have to do this? And then another question might be, what are the details I need to include on my clinical trial material that I prepare to be used in clinical trials? And if I'm using, so I might manufacture in one place, but it's going to be used in clinical trials across 4 different countries. Is the labeling exactly the same, or do I need to maybe include other details or have it translated into different languages? So it might sound like a finicky detail, but it's very, very important, because you need to follow these if you want to get approved and not have any deviances from what you're expected to follow. So I've given you some tips here, and I will share these slides. So if you ever want to just click on those particular links, you can get to them. But what I would recommend is we start with looking at what is the pharmacovigilance framework in Australia, and then we can run a comparison across, say, the 5 different countries and have a look at what is expected there. And then we can also look at, say, the investigational material labelling and what's required across those different countries. So in the, I'm going to go back. I sent out some PDFs before that you could look at and compare, but what we could do is go into the system and just have a quick look on how we would address that question. So we could start by looking at the regulatory summary. So this is really the first point of call for any area you might have questions around if you don't understand the requirements in the country. And we could look at, so if I'm starting in Australia, I can look at what are the pharmacovigilance requirements in Australia. So this will summarise the requirements in Australia, including the legal framework, reporting requirements and responsibilities. So you'd have a document you can consult there with all of the updated guidelines. So as you can see, there's a lot of change even in this current year. So new information around antibiotic resistance and risk management plans. So there's a lot you have to keep up with, but if you come here, all of that will be summarised here. So that will give us an idea about what is the pharmacovigilance requirements in that country. But then we could have a look at the comparisons and say, okay, say I'm running my trial in Australia, but also we could pick a few Asian countries and maybe the US. Then how can I align my reporting to make sure that I'm compliant across all those countries? So we have a few topics there you can view, but we'll go straight to pre-marketing pharmacovigilance. So that would be around what do I need to report for clinical trials, so before the drug's been launched. So we can come straight here. So I am going to turn off the regions filter, and I'm going to just select a few countries. So let's say we'll have a look at Australia, maybe China. We could say Hong Kong, and then maybe we'll include the US, the United Kingdom, and we could even look at the EU if you're interested in that area. And that will just mean that we can focus our attention on the requirements in those specific countries. So we don't really have to go into the detail of it, but this will tell us, do we need to report serious unexpected reactions, and if you hover over here, it will describe them, and what is the time frame I need to submit them to, and this is for the different countries. And we can already see that there's a difference between the reporting expected for China as well as Australia. And then we can also see if we need to report foreign adverse effects. So it really depends on the country. So no in Australia, but there are some extra conditions. You will need to advise the experimental drug section of the drug safety evaluation branch within 72 hours if there's any significant safety issue. And then you'll also need to routinely update the TGA or the ethics committee. So it really depends on the country, but this is one way you can very quickly see how variant those requirements are and how you could streamline them, generally by picking the most stringent requirement, and then if you follow that, you should be okay with the other countries. And then you can always link to the summary here if you need to understand that. So those are often the most popular document that we find people consult because they just don't have time to read it at like 50 guidelines and pull all that information together. And then the last thing I wanted to show you is if you want to just understand maybe a particular area, if there's any guidelines around, for example, DMD, or you might be looking at oncology products, what are the specific requirements for oncology products? You can always just throw the words in and then run filters to narrow down on that search and see what you're looking for. So in this case, I've just used an example of DMD guidelines. But what you might also look at is whether there are ethnicity requirements for clinical trials or bridging studies. A lot of people will look at GMP. So what's the GMP requirement for the drug I want to use in a clinical trial, or eventually when it gets marketed or approved? And are there instructions on expanded access or compassionate use drugs? So where there's no drugs available, if they want to maybe continue using these drugs for a clinical trial even after the trial is over, but it hasn't yet been approved. And you can also go straight in and have a look at a product approval package as well, just by throwing the drug's name in. So I've included on the slide deck just some instructions on how you can filter through. So in that example, I've searched for a DMD guidelines. I can choose the country I want to look at. I'll point out here, we do have a filter on date, but many guidelines are quite old but still valid, so I don't usually recommend that you ever put a date filter on anything, because a 20-year-old guideline might still be in use. And then you can select, so a reference document is what we call the agency documents. You can make sure you're looking at a valid document and then narrow down on the thing you're looking at. So in this case, I'm looking at a guideline, but if those terms match, say, a product approval package, you could select that. It depends on what you're looking at. And then you'll narrow down on a list of guidelines related to that specific topic. So here we have some guidelines that were issued by the FDA around how you would develop a drug for DMD. So that really takes me to the end of the sort of product or the tool description. And I just thought it would be good to recommend that you do have a look at it, because you have this access for 2 weeks. I don't believe you can export documents on the trial, but if there's something you find really interesting and you'd like to have a copy of it, then you're welcome to email me and I can send you a copy of that. And we'll also follow up with an email with the key. So you probably received most of these through, I think Holly sent them to you, but we'll send you a list of some of the key ones that could be of interest to you. So we've got clinical research within Australia, as well as the medical devices and IVD framework, and an example of the bulletins for those DMD drugs that were approved. So that's the end of my talk. I'll just leave that there. And if anyone had any questions for Louise or myself, then we're happy to have a chat with you after the session.